Welcome to the ADF Architecture TV channel. My name is Chris Muir. I'm an ADF Product Manager working for Oracle Corporation. In today's episode, we're going to continue on from the previous episode where we started looking at ADF code and naming guidelines for developers, and we also started looking at project layout conventions. So we want to continue with that today for developers to give some standards and some guidelines from Oracle Corp on how we think you should lay out both the structures, the directories, and the packages within your ADF workspace projects. Now, just before we dive in there, I hope this little cupboard back here gives you a little bit of an idea of what you should have actively at your organization. Now, of course, you should have Star Wars memorabilia, okay, very important for all the geeks among us. But most importantly, in addition, you really should have a set of latest ADF texts, and such that developers, junior, senior developers are continuously going back to those texts to learn, revisit, actually reinforce what they know, and find out new and separate techniques. I will freely admit that the books by my colleagues Lynn Mussinger and Frank Nivtius, the first time I read that book, I probably only understood about a quarter of it. But I still frequently reread that book in order to get, there's a technique I didn't know about. And I really do encourage your staff, if they want to be professional programmers, just not seasoned ADF developers, professional programmers, to revisit these sort of texts all the time. Now, further to that in your organization, it's also important that senior developers and team leads pass around all the guidelines that your developers should be looking into. So this includes things like your architecture documents, but also your standards and guidelines documents for how the applications are being laid out, your UI and your UX guidelines for the actual visual layout of your application, and a lot of the guidelines that we're particularly talking about in this set of episodes. Actively push your staff to engage this material. Don't just assume they're finding it out on the internet or finding it on some internal wiki. Make sure they're cognizant of it, and hey, even have debates about some of that material, because maybe you need to revise some of that content because you know something better now. You're more experienced than when you implemented your last ADF application. Anyway, let's crack on. Let's now go and talk about ADF project layout and conventions, how to lay out your packages, your directory structures, and so on and so forth under your model and your ViewController projects. Now, just before we dive into the project and layout guidelines, just a reminder from the previous episode that the ADF naming and project layout guidelines that we're talking about in this presentation, well, this is really just an abbreviation or a summary of the guidelines that come from the same name documents on the ADF Architecture Square OTN website. You can see the bit.ly link here. And also, as a reminder, remember these are conventions and guidelines, but not the law, not black letter law. So you are free to change them, you are free to disagree with them, you are free to have your own guidelines. Oracle's goal in providing these is to give teams out there an accelerator, essentially, by, well, we're giving them to you now rather than having to write your own. But if you've already got your own, you think you want to do something different from what Oracle's proposing, that's fine. Don't come back and say, Oracle, you need to have plurals on your objects rather than singular names. This stuff really doesn't matter. Just get on with the job. Also, to continue from the previous episode, you might remember that we took the sum of the parts architectural pattern and we turned it into a real application, one that is a HR application divided up components of departments and employees in a common workspace. So this particular diagram here summarizes that down. We don't have the original complicated diagram that was in the ADF Architectural Patterns episode, but in particular here you can see we have a common workspace, an EMP for employee workspace to contain the employee related bounded task flows, the DEP workspace for the department bounded task flow workspace, and the HR workspaces, which is the actual application or the composite or master application that brings it all together. Now, you would also remember from the previous episode, we said for the major projects within these workspaces that they would have a default package. So for the common workspace, for its model project, its default package would be com.acme.common.model. For the EMP workspace and the DEP workspace, their default packages would be com.acme.flow.emp.view and com.acme.flow.dep.view for both ViewController projects that they would contain. Finally, the HR workspace, com.acme.app.hr.view. So we need to talk about that now because basically we're going to use those base package structures to explain the other project layout and guidelines that we're going to consume or talk about in the rest of this episode. So in considering our ADF business components part of our application, which in our architectural pattern goes in the common workspace model project, what we can see here is that we use the default package com.acme.common.model to store all our business component objects. And in this specific entry, you can see the model.jpx entry. But in addition, you might notice that, well, beyond com.acme common model, we also have ADF BC as a sub-package name. Why? Because ADF business components may not be the only model layer technology or business service layer technology that you include in your overall application. There might be something else that you decide to include in your application. So we're using the .adf BC here to basically differentiate between the ADF business components and whatever other technologies you're going to include. As we move on here, we can see that, well, we do have a suggestion that from Oracle Corp, we obviously recommend that you, for ADF business components, include a set of framework extension classes. And if you to do that, within the package structures that we're proposing, you would use com.acme.common.model.adfbc.base to basically place all those 10 Java classes we instruct you to create. So here you can see HR app module impl.java. Further to that, if you're going to create application modules, then we assume that you would put them in a .services package. So you can see the example here again, com.acme common model ADFBC services, and then HR app module is our specific application module example in this case. Now, from here, it's pretty obvious what we're doing. We have a subdirectory or a package for domains. We have one for entities. For entity associations, we actually have com.acme.common.model ADFBC.entities.associations. So we put the associations under a sub-package of entities because associations only relate to entities. Okay, property sets, kind of obvious what we're doing here. Validation rules, again, obvious. Updatable view objects. Now, they're really going to be the most common type of view object in our ADF 11G and 12C applications. So they go into com.acme common model ADFBC views, and we've got employees view as an example. Now from there though, read-only view objects and programmatic view objects are going to be fairly much rarer. But we kind of want to use the package structure to delineate from them because they are special cases. So as you can see here, what we've done under com.acme common model ADFBC views is we've created sub-package structures read-only and programmatic to deliberately separate them out. In addition, just like entity associations, where the associations is a sub-package of entities, we're doing the same things with the view links here. Now there is something worthwhile noting about the package structure that I've proposed, or we've proposed for ADF business components here. You can obviously see that we're creating a package structure based around the types of business components. Now that's just one way to skin a cat, to coin a phrase. Another approach to laying out your package structures is by business function. So in our example, we have a bunch of business objects to do with employees, a bunch of business objects to do with departments, entity objects, view objects, validations, and so on and so forth. We could actually lay out our package structures based around the business areas. Alternatively, around the functions of our application. Imagine you have EOs, VOs, AMs that have got to deal with your shopping cart part of your application. You could have a package structure that breaks up your application that way. Now, none of these approaches are necessarily right or wrong over the others. They're just all different ways of laying out your package structures. But the one we've proposed here is probably the one that's going to work for most customers until you get into bigger scale applications, or alternatively, let's say you have an object-oriented background. So pick what works for you, but the one that we proposed here has been used numerous times by many customers out there. Okay, so now we've considered our model project and the ADF business components, and that would go in our common workspace. Now let's consider our ViewController projects. And remember, in our architectural pattern, we have a EMP workspace, a DEP workspace, and if you remember back to our ADF architectural patterns episodes, that would be a set of bounded task flow workspaces. In addition, we have a HR workspace, the master or composite workspace, that would have our unbounded task flows. So now let's talk about laying out, in terms of project layout, our bounded task flows and our unbounded task flows. Now logically it would make sense to start with the UTF and then explain the BTF, but there's a bit of a nuance in the unbounded task flows that will make things slightly complicated. So to keep the discussion simple, we'll start with our bounded task flows and how to lay those out. So let's address some of the challenges you will have with laying out your bounded task flows in your ViewController projects. Now, just as a reminder from the earlier parts of this episode, that the base packages that we would specify for our ViewController packages in our bounded task flow workspaces, some examples could be com.acme.flow.department.view or com.acme.flow.emp.view. Now, we know that JDeveloper by default will place bounded task flows under the ViewController public HTML web inf directory. In addition, pages and page fragments under ViewController public HTML. But JDeveloper will place page defs under ViewController ADF M source com acme flow department view page def. In addition, it will place beans under ViewController source com acme flow department view. Now, if you look at where the BTFs are located, the pages and fragments for those bounded task flows, and the relating page defs and beans, the structures alone make it very hard to relate the code artifacts. So one of our primary goals here is to make it much easier for developers when they're looking at the bounded task flows and the page fragments and the page defs and the beans to know that they're all related. So let's use the structures here to solve that problem. So the goal here is to use the same directory structure for all artifacts. So for our bounded task flows, rather than just putting them in ViewController public HTML web inf, we'll include a subdirectory structure of the default package for the project com acme flow department view and the name of the task flow and then the relating task flow file. In addition, where we previously put page and fragments under ViewController public HTML, now let's include a public, or I should say directory structure, com acme flow department view department task flow, and there you can see an example of a page. In addition, already we know that our page def files are going to go under ViewController ADFM source, com acme flow department view department task flow page def view department page def. Finally, our beans, ViewController source, com acme flow department view department task flow department bean.java. So now very quickly up and down that directory structures there, ignoring the initial directory structure. So for example, for BTFs, it's ViewController public HTML web inf, and for beans, it's ViewController source. Putting those aside, the other directory structures that we've used here very quickly now make us realize what relates to what. And this shall help developers understand the artifacts that are basically intertwined or have dependencies in our overall ViewController application project. Now let's consider the unbounded task flows and some of the challenges we will hit there in laying those out. Now just as a reminder, an example package for the HR application workspace and its ViewController project where the UTF will exist would be com.acme.app.hr.view. Now there is a nuance of the UTF or unbounded task flow file. With bounded task flows, they certainly go under ViewController public HTML web inf, but they can go in under any subdirectory underneath that. But with your ADFC config XML files, they must reside in the ViewController public HTML web inf base directory. Now, even with that in mind, if you create pages for the unbounded task flow, typically they will be placed by JDeveloper under the ViewController public HTML directory, but the page defs will be placed under, very similar to previous, under ViewController ADFM source com acme app hr view page def. In addition, your beans will be placed under ViewController source com acme app hr view. Now, because of that limitation where the ADFC config XML file resides, we simply cannot use the same project layout structures that we use for the bounded task flows. We need to come up with a different solution. So the solution with our unbounded task flows is to instead assume that artifacts placed at the ViewController public HTML web inf directory and artifacts at the ViewController public HTML directory, and artifacts at the ViewController ADF M source com acme app HR view subdirectory or package structure, and ViewController source com acme app HR view are all logical base structures for all your different UTF artifacts. So ultimately you just assume this is where you expect to find your unbounded taskload artifacts. You will find the ADFC config under the webinf, the pages for the UTF under the public HTML directory, any page defs under the ADFM source com acme app HR view directory, and any beans under this source com acme app HR view package. So basically you don't need to move anything around, and for the unbounded task flow, because we only have one, you wouldn't actually be moving too many things around anyway, because there's not typically too many artifacts associated with your unbounded task flow. Great, so at this point we've looked at the different package and directory structures that we can apply to our ADF business components and our ViewController projects. Now, talking about our ViewController projects with our bounded task flows in them, there is another issue that we need to talk about in terms of bounded task flows specifically. When we have applications which are broken up into multiple workspaces with bounded task flows spread across those workspaces, when the team leader or the developer are responsible for assuming those BTF workspaces back into the master workspace, brings them all in, through the Oracle JDeveloper resource palette, one of the things it will enforce is that the bounded task flows that we are bringing in have unique IDs. So this is the namespace for each of the bounded task flows needs to essentially be unique. And as you can imagine, when we've got separate development teams working on different parts of our application, often different BTF workspaces, this can be a hard thing to enforce. So let's talk about a couple of the solutions to that problem. But before we do that, we've got to answer the question, well, how or what is a bounded task flow ID? How is that actually structured such that we know how to make them unique? Well, a bounded task flow is identified by really three components: the directory structure that it's placed in, the name of the bounded task flow file itself, and the name of the bounded task flow ID field within the bounded task flow XML file. The combination of those three fields is what uniquely identifies a bounded task flow. Okay, so we now know how they're uniquely identified. What solutions do we have in place to solve that problem of a namespace collision? So what solutions do we need to put in place in order to avoid this bounded task flow namespace collision problem? Well, basically, if you followed the guidelines that we outlined for the bounded task flows previously, that with the package, the default package name for the ViewController project, which is guaranteed to be unique across all your ViewController projects of all your workspaces if you follow the previous guidelines, that directory structure, as you know, we said inject into the actual location where the XML file for the task flow is located. So in the example here where we have a task flow called create employees task flow XML, we don't place that within the public HTML webinf directory, we place it under a subdirectory structure, public HTML webinf com acme flows empview, create employees task flow, and then the task flow itself. Now, just by following those guidelines, the overall bounded task flow ID will be a combination of all of those, including that unique package that we've actually used for the ViewController project. And now we basically get a mechanism for uniquely identifying our bounded task flows across all workspaces. Now, this is very much based on the assumption that you have given each workspace a unique package name and each ViewController project as an extension of that a unique package name as well. If you haven't followed that guideline, this mechanism here won't work for you. So one of the things I really like about these guidelines and conventions that we've been giving you, that, initially it does seem a little bit more extra work. Oracle, why are you telling us to do this? But it's only after you get through to building quite a large solution do you start to see that the benefits pay off, because there are issues with namespace collisions, as we saw with bounded task flows. And when you think about these guidelines and conventions, when you're building a small application, a lot of these conventions and guidelines really are overkill, aren't they? But with guidelines and conventions, there's often having a look to the future where you may move from a very simple application architecture to some of the more sophisticated ADF application architectures that we have talked about in previous episodes. So these guidelines and conventions, if you follow now, are a little bit painful. In the long term, will actually solve you a whole bunch of refactoring and rework in order to get all the different parts of your larger applications together. So thanks again for joining us on the ADF Architecture TV channel today. My name's Chris Muir. I hope you'll join us on the very next episode, to be published very soon.